The accusation the Carrington estate sat like a fortress above the Pacific, its white stone walls catching the last of the sun as evening descended. The wind that came off the ocean carried a salty sharpness, a constant reminder of the wild power. Below the cliffs, inside, the air was still, controlled, immaculate, just as Ethan Carrington liked it. Every room, every schedule, every detail of his daughter Lila's life was meticulously arranged. It had to be. He had lost too much already to allow chaos to slip in through any open door. Since his wife's passing 4 years ago, his sole focus had been to protect Lila, protect her from sickness, from strangers, from anything he couldn't predict or control. But tonight, chaos wasn't slipping in quietly. It was marching straight into his living room in the form of a scene that froze his blood. He had just returned from an early dinner meeting, the kind where billion-dollar mergers were agreed upon. Over a glass of wine and a few carefully chosen words. His phone was still buzzing in his pocket with unanswered calls when he walked into the living room and stopped dead. Lila sat curled on the plush cream sofa, her small frame swallowed in a blanket, her dark hair sticking to her forehead with the faint sheen of sweat. In her hands, no, in the hands of Grace Williams, the new housemaid he had hired barely 2 weeks ago, was a mug of something thick and brown, steam curling up in slow ribbons. The air was filled with an earthy, pungent smell he didn't recognize, a smell that seemed out of place in his pristine home. Grace was kneeling beside Lila, her voice low but urgent. "Just a few more sips, sweetheart. It'll help." Ethan's vision tunneled, his heartbeat slamming into his ears. "What the hell is that?" His voice cracked through the air like a whip, startling both Lila and Grace. The mug wobbled in Grace's hands. She turned toward him, her eyes steady but wide. "She needs to drink this, Mr. Carrington. Now she needs to drink poison?" He cut in, his words laced with disbelief and fury. In 3 long strides he was there, his hand snatching the mug away so fast that hot liquid splashed onto the expensive rug. The smell was even stronger now, bitter and sharp. His grip on the handle tightened. "What did you give my daughter?" Grace rose to her feet slowly, her palms open in front of her, her voice even despite the tension in her body. "She got into something dangerous in the kitchen. I'm counteracting it before it kills her?" Ethan's laugh was humorless, the kind that barely masked fear. "You think I'm going to stand here and let you feed her some witch's brew?" He turned to Lila, scooping her into his arms. Her small body felt too warm, and that was all the proof he needed that something was wrong. Her breaths came faster than normal, her fingers clutching at his shirt. "Daddy, my tummy," she began, but he was already moving toward the hallway. "Thomas!" He barked toward the foyer, his voice echoing off the marble. "Car, now!" Grace's voice followed him, firmer now, threaded with desperation. "Mr. Carrington, if you take her without finishing the drink, she could—" He stopped so suddenly that Lila's head bumped against his shoulder. Pivoting, he fixed Grace with a stare so sharp it could have cut glass. "You've been here 2 weeks. I know nothing about you except what my housekeeper tells me. And now I walk in to find you giving my daughter some mystery sludge? You're lucky I'm not calling the police right now." Her eyes glistened but didn't waver. "Call them if you must. But let me help her first." The nerve of her, the audacity to stand there and act like she had a say, and this ignited a spark of rage deep in his chest. He turned on his heel and strode toward the front door where Thomas already had the SUV idling, headlights pooling. Light across the driveway. He didn't look back, but he heard her footsteps follow, quick but hesitant. "Mr. Carrington, please, stay here," he snapped, his voice so sharp it cut her mid-sentence. "You're not coming near my daughter." Again, he slid into the back seat with Lila, who was now pale and breathing shallowly, her eyes glassy. The ride to the hospital was a blur of city lights and white-knuckled fear. Ethan kept his hand on Lila's back, counting every rise and fall of her chest. Each breath felt like it might be the last before something irreversible happened. He thought about every nightmare he had ever had since his wife died, Lila slipping away from him because he failed to protect her. This felt like one of those dreams, only worse, because it wasn't a dream at all. At the emergency entrance, Doctors took her from his arms in a rush of blue scrubs and beeping monitors. Ethan paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his mind replaying the moment he had walked in to find Grace with that mug. What kind of person did that? He had seen plenty of people try to work their way into wealthy households with fake smiles and carefully rehearsed trustworthiness. Money was a magnet for opportunists. And he, of all people, should have known better than to let a stranger anywhere near his daughter's health. It was nearly 40 minutes later when a doctor emerged, pulling down his mask and scanning the room until his eyes landed on Ethan. "Mr. Carrington?" Ethan was already moving toward him, his voice low but urgent. "How is she?" "She's stable," the doctor said. "And you have your maid to thank for that." Ethan froze. Sure, he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" The doctor's gaze was steady, professional, but there was an edge to it, like he was holding back his own judgment. "Your daughter ingested a small amount of household cleaner, likely a degreaser or something similar. The herbal drink she was given neutralized the worst of the chemical reaction before you even got here. Without it, we might be looking at significant internal burns or worse." The words landed heavy, thudding against his chest in a way no business, failure or public scandal ever had. "You're saying she saved Lila?" "That's exactly what I'm saying." The doctor's tone left no room for misinterpretation. "You should talk to her." He turned and walked back down the hall, leaving Ethan standing there, the weight of his own misjudgment pressing down on him like a physical thing. He thought of Grace's eyes when she had said, "Let me help her first." He thought of how quickly he had shut her out. And now, the only thing keeping his daughter safe had been the thing he had ripped away. By the time he was allowed into Lila's room, she was propped up in bed and four in her arm, her skin less pale than before. She looked up at him with a faint smile. "Daddy, you were really mad at Grace." His throat tightened. "I thought she was hurting you," he said softly. Lila shook her head with the small, deliberate movements of someone still tired. "No, I was thirsty, so I drank from the wrong bottle in the kitchen. It tasted bad, and then Grace made me drink her tea. I didn't want to, but she said it would help, and it did. My tummy doesn't hurt so much now." Ethan sat heavily in the chair beside her bed, his mind turning over each word like a blade. He stayed there long after she drifted back to sleep, the quiet beeping of the monitors filling the silence. When the door opened again, it was Grace. She stepped inside. Hesitantly, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, the front of her blouse dark from the spill. Her gaze moved first to Lila, then to him. He stood, not sure if his next words would come out right. "Grace, I was wrong. About you, about everything I said." She didn't speak, only watched him with those steady, unreadable eyes. "I can't undo what I said, but I can tell you I'm grateful. You saved her, and I owe you more than I can ever repay." Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "I didn't do it for you, Mr. Carrington. I did it for her." The honesty in that statement hit him harder than the doctor's words had. "I know," he said. "That's why I want you to stay. Not as a temporary maid, but as Lila's full-time caretaker, with the pay and respect you deserve. If you'll agree." For the first time since he'd met her, a faint, almost reluctant smile touched her lips. "I'll think about it." And just like that, she turned back toward Lila, pulling the blanket up gently around the little girl's shoulders, her movements careful, deliberate, and filled with the kind of care that couldn't be faked. In that quiet room, under the sterile hospital lights, Ethan felt something shift inside him, a fracture in the walls he had built so high around his trust. He wasn't ready to admit it fully, but part of him knew. If Grace had been a stranger 2 weeks ago, she wasn't anymore. And whatever story she carried in her past, it was now entwined with his own. Cracks in the ice morning light spread across the Carrington estate like a slow spill of gold, seeping in through the tall windows and pooling in the corners of rooms that usually felt cold and untouched. It was the first morning since the hospital scare, and Ethan found himself lingering in the upstairs hallway outside Lila's room, coffee in hand, listening to the low hum of voices. Lila's giggle floated through the half-open door, light and unguarded. and it startled him more than any corporate crisis ever could. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard that sound without it being forced, without it being something coaxed out for the benefit of guests or distant relatives. It was genuine, rolling, and warm, like the laughter of a child who felt safe. When he finally pushed the door open, he found Grace kneeling beside the bed, her hair pulled back neatly, the morning light catching in its strands, her hands guiding Lila as they tried to fold a small blanket into the shape of a bear. The bed was still rumpled, but there was life in the room, movement, and the kind of quiet mess that comes from living rather than simply existing. He cleared his throat, and Grace glanced up, not startled, but aware. "Good morning, Mr. Carrington," she said with that same calm tone she had carried since day one, the kind that didn't bow, but didn't provoke either. Lila twisted around to face him, her eyes bright. "Daddy, she paused, catching herself. Grace brought me breakfast in bed." He raised an eyebrow at the tray on the knit-stand, scrambled eggs, sliced strawberries, and a slice of toast cut into a heart. "That's very thoughtful," he said slowly, his eyes flicking to Grace. She gave the smallest shrug. "Food tastes better when someone makes it with care. And she needs to keep eating if she's going to recover fully." It wasn't a challenge, but it was close enough to remind him that her way of doing things wasn't just about service, it was about purpose. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled different now. The sharp scent of cleaning products had been replaced by warm, homely note cinnamon from oatmeal cooling on the counter, the faint freshness of chopped herbs drying by the window. Ethan took his usual place at the long dining table, but found himself lingering over breakfast instead of rushing off to the office. Grace moved quietly, clearing plates with efficiency, but without the stiffness of a servant afraid to be seen. Lila chattered between bites, telling stories about a book Grace had read to her the night before. He listened more than he spoke, feeling a peculiar dissonance. This was his home, his table, his daughter, and yet he was an observer to a rhythm that didn't revolve entirely around him anymore. It was later that afternoon when the first real tension arose. He had been in his study reviewing a contract when he heard Lila's voice from the garden, her tone edging toward protest. He stepped outside to find her standing near the patio table, a plate in front of her with bright slices of mango and cucumber. Grace was beside her, speaking in that even voice she always used when she wanted a point to land. "Just one bite, Lila, you might like it." Lila's arms were crossed, her chin tipped up in a defiance he recognized all too well. It was the same stubborn streak her mother had possessed. "I don't want it. It's slimy," she said, drawing the word out like a dare. Grace didn't move, her posture calm but unyielding. "Sometimes things that help us don't feel nice at first," she said. "Your body needs this." Ethan's instinct was immediate: step in, remove the source of discomfort, shield his daughter. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cool but edged. Grace looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "We're working on expanding her diet. Fresh fruit and vegetables are important for her recovery." He glanced at Lila, who had already stepped behind him, using his presence like a shield. "Daddy, I told her I don't want it." For a moment, the past threatened to replay itself, him siding with Lila without question, Grace being shut down, but the memory of the hospital was still fresh, and he found himself hesitating. Grace's gaze didn't waver. "You hired me to care for her," she said quietly. "That means helping her build habits that will keep her healthy. I won't force her, but I won't stop encouraging her either." There was something in her tone, measured, sure, but with an undercurrent of conviction that made him pause. He crouched to Lila's level, remembering the way she had described Grace's tea at the hospital. "Sweetheart, remember how you didn't want to drink that brown stuff, but it helped your tummy?" Lila frowned. "That was different." "Was it?" he asked gently. "Sometimes the things we don't like at first turn out to be good for us." She looked between them, suspicion and curiosity battling in her expression. Finally, Grace cut a small piece of mango and held it out. After a moment's hesitation, Lila took it, chewed, and made a face at the texture but swallowed. "It's okay," she admitted reluctantly. Grace smiled faintly. "That's all I ask. Just try." That night, after Lila was asleep, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen, drying the last of the dinner dishes. He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You handled that well?" he said, his voice less guarded than usual. She glanced at him. Over her shoulder, "I'm not here to make her miserable. But change doesn't happen if we avoid every challenge. She's stronger than you think." He thought about the small bite of mango, about the way Lila had looked proud afterward even if she didn't admit it. "You believe in her more than I've allowed myself to," he said. Grace set down the dish towel. "Because you're afraid. I understand that. But fear can keep a child small, and she's ready to grow." Her words stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. 2 days later, he suggested they all go to the weekend farmers market. It was the kind of bustling, colorful place he usually avoided. Too many people, too many variables, but Grace agreed instantly. And Lila, though hesitant at first, was drawn in by her enthusiasm. They walked past stalls overflowing with fruit, the air rich with the scent of ripe peaches and fresh bread. Grace bought Lila a slice of apple dusted with cinnamon from a smiling vendor, and to Ethan's surprise, she ate it without complaint. At one point, as they made their way back to the car, he noticed Lila slip her hand into Grace's. The sight pulled at something deep in him: gratitude, humility, and a quiet realization that perhaps he didn't have to be the only one holding her world together. That evening, after tucking Lila in, Ethan lingered in the doorway, watching her drift into sleep. Grace passed by, pausing when he said her name. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for the hospital, but for making things feel alive again." She met his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'm just doing what I promised, giving her the care she deserves." And then, before walking away, she added, "The rest is up to you." Her words lingered long after she was gone, echoing in the quiet of the hall. The shadow of the past, the quiet rhythm that had begun to settle over the Carrington estate, didn't feel fragile to Ethan at first. If anything, it felt like something solid was finally taking root after years of running on control and habit. Mornings had shifted from stiff breakfasts eaten in near silence to something almost normal. Lila's laughter could be heard on the stairs, her voice drifting through the halls as she and Grace worked on crafts, or as Grace read aloud from some book Ethan had never thought to buy her. Evenings were calmer till Lila went to bed without protest, sometimes drifting off before the second story ended. Ethan found himself staying home more, lingering over dinner, and though he would never say it aloud, listening for the sound of Grace's voice in the background, knowing it meant his daughter was safe. But as he had learned too many times in business and in life, the moment you start to believe something is unshakable is often the exact moment a crack forms. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, just past 3, while Ethan was in his study on a video call with a board member. Thomas, the estate's driver, knocked and stepped inside with an expression Ethan hadn't seen in years, tight-lipped, cautious as if delivering news that couldn't be softened. "Sir," Thomas said quietly, "there are 2 police officers at the front gate. They say they need to speak with you about your employee, Miss Williams." Ethan's stomach gave a small, unwelcome lurch. "Police?" he repeated, his voice low enough to avoid carrying over the still-open call. Thomas nodded once. "They've asked to come inside." He ended the call without explanation, rose from his chair, and walked toward the front hall. The air seemed heavier with each step. At the door stood 2 men in plainclothes: Detective Harris, tall and weathered, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing, and his younger partner, clipboard in hand. Harris extended a card as he spoke. "Mr. Carrington, we'd like to ask you a few questions about Miss Grace Williams. It's regarding an incident that took place in Pasadena 2 years ago." Grace's name in his ear now sounded different, like a thread pulled too sharply through fabric. "What kind of incident?" Ethan asked, his tone flat. Harris's gaze was steady but unreadable. "It involves a child in her care who became ill. No charges were filed, but new information has come to light. We're reopening the case." Ethan didn't invite them further in. "Not yet," he told Thomas to find Grace and bring her to the front hall. It was only a minute before she appeared. still in her garden clothes, dirt on her hands, and a light sheen of sweat. Across her brow from planting herbs with Lila, she froze when she saw the two officers. Her eyes flicked to Ethan's, searching for something, maybe a warning, maybe reassurance, and found neither. "Miss Williams," Harris began, "we'd like to speak with you about your previous employment in Pasadena. Specifically about a child you were caring for who fell ill under your supervision." Grace's voice was calm, but Ethan saw the muscle in her jaw tighten. "I know what this is about," she said quietly. Ethan turned to her sharply. "Then perhaps you'd better tell me now before I hear it from them." For a long beat she didn't answer. Then, with a breath that seemed heavier than the room could hold, she said, 2 years ago, I was working for the Halle family in Pasadena. Their little girl ate something that made her sick, something I recognized the signs of instantly. I mixed an herbal remedy from what I had in the kitchen to counteract it while we waited for an ambulance. She recovered. But later, her parents accused me of giving her the poison in the first place. They claimed I was reckless and dangerous. There was an investigation, but no evidence, no charges. Still, the damage was done. Ethan's arms folded across his chest, his face unreadable but his mind in motion. "And you didn't think to tell me this before I hired you?" Her answer was immediate, almost too quick. "Would you have listened?" The air between them felt like a taut wire. Harris's partner cleared his throat. "We just need to confirm your account, Ms. Williams. You can answer here or at the station." Grace lifted her chin. "I'll answer here." She stood through each question with the same calm she had shown when facing Ethan's initial fury weeks ago, naming the herbs she'd used, the symptoms she'd recognized, the fact that the hospital had discharged the girl within a day. When they were done, Harris left his card and said, "If you think of anything else, call me directly." When the door closed, Ethan remained in place, the echo of it like a punctuation mark he didn't want to read. Grace looked at him, her voice quiet but steady. "I have never harmed a child, and Lila knows that better than anyone." From the far end of the hall came a smaller voice. "Daddy?" Lila stood there clutching a basket of lavender sprigs. They had been cutting earlier. Her gaze moved from Ethan to Grace, confusion clouding her face. "Why are you mad at her?" "I'm not," Ethan began, but Lila stepped forward, her voice urgent in a way he rarely heard from her. "She makes me feel safe. Don't make her leave." Grace bent down, meeting Lila's eyes with a softness Ethan had seen many times but never fully understood. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just have to answer questions so everyone knows the truth." That night, the house was quieter than usual. Lila went to bed without a bedtime story, saying she was too tired, and Ethan stayed in his study long past midnight. He stared at the darkened window, the reflection of his own face framed against the faint movement of the ocean outside. In business, his instincts had saved him more times than he could count, but in this, his instincts had been wrong before, disastrously so. The question that gnawed at him now was whether they were failing him again. At nearly 2 a.m, he picked up his phone and called David Larson, his oldest friend and one of the few people he trusted without question. "I need a favor," he said when David answered grudgingly. "I want everything you can find on the Pasadena case, medical records, police notes, anything. I don't care how you get it. I need to know the truth." David hesitated. "Ethan, this isn't your fight." "It is now," Ethan replied, his voice low but certain, "because my daughter trusts her. And if that trust is misplaced, I need to be the one to face it, not her." When he hung up, he leaned back in his chair and let the silence press in. Somewhere upstairs, Grace was asleep, or maybe not. Maybe she was lying awake, waiting to see if the cracks that had begun to show in Ethan's trust would spread far enough to push her out entirely. What she couldn't know yet was that Ethan, for the first time in years, had no interest in letting something break without first knowing who, or what, had put the crack there. Power and prejudice 3 days after the police visit, the rhythm of the Carrington estate had shifted again, not in a dramatic, crashing way, but in the quieter, more dangerous way a ship changes course by a single degree. You barely feel it at first, but, it's taking you somewhere different. Grace still moved through her days with the same deliberate efficiency, preparing Lila's breakfast, tending to the herb garden, reading on the back terrace in the late afternoons. Yet Ethan noticed the small changes, the way she would pause at the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive, the way her gaze lingered a little longer on the front gate when Thomas opened it for deliveries, the way her posture straightened when Lila came into the room, as if every movement was a quiet promise that nothing would get past her. Ethan had not told her what he'd been doing since that night, calling in favors, speaking to people who owed him debts, leaning on the kind of connections he rarely used unless billions of dollars were at stake. Only this time, it wasn't a company's future on the line. It was a woman's name he couldn't explain to himself when that had become worth as much as any deal he had ever closed. But it had. On a gray Thursday morning, David called back. "I've got something," he said without preamble. It wasn't easy. "The hospital records from Pasadena are sealed, but I know a guy on the medical board who owed me a favor. You're going to want to see this in person." Ethan left for the city within the hour, telling Thomas only that he had business downtown. The drive was long and the coastal fog was thick, curling around the cliffs and swallowing the horizon. But his mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. David met him in a private office at a medical building, a thin manila folder on the table between them. "You understand," David said, capping the folder. "This doesn't leave here." Ethan nodded, flipping it open. The first page was a copy of the A intake report, the Halle girl's name redacted, age 7, presenting with mild nausea and abdominal pain. Ethan scanned the doctor's handwritten notes. Patient stabilized quickly. Symptoms consistent with ingestion of non-toxic plant matter in small quantity. Caregiver administered herbal infusion prior to arrival may have mitigated discomfort. He turned the page, finding a short discharge, summary released within 24 hours. No complications, advised to monitor at home. There was nothing to suggest poisoning or harm. "Then why?" Ethan said slowly. "Was she accused?" David leaned back, his expression carrying that weary knowledge of how the world worked. The father Victor Hale sits on multiple corporate boards, one of them a donor to the local news station. Once he decided Grace was the problem, the story was shaped to fit. By the time the truth could have been told, it didn't matter. It wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about influence. Ethan felt the cold edge of anger slide under his skin. He knew that kind of power. He had seen it ruin competitors, sink startups, silence voices that didn't have the money to fight back. But to aim it at someone like Grace, to take her livelihood, her name, for nothing more than convenience or prejudice, there was a rot in that went beyond business. When he returned to the estate that afternoon, he found her in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, planting more chamomile near the window boxes. Lila was beside her, filling small pots with dirt, the two of them talking quietly. He stood there for a moment, watching, before he stepped forward. "Lila, why don't you go inside and wash up for dinner? I need to talk to Grace." She went without protest, though she looked between them as if sensing something important was about to be said. Grace didn't look up until he was right beside her. "I went to the city today," he said, his voice measured. "I've seen the hospital records." That made her still, her hands frozen in the soil. Slowly she sat back on her heels and turned to face him. "And they back you completely," he said. "The girl was never poisoned. The herbal drink helped her, and she was home the next day. Everything else was a fabrication." He watched her closely, expecting relief, maybe gratitude. Instead, her shoulders lowered, and she gave a small, humorless laugh. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I did, because I was wrong once. I'm not making that mistake again." He hesitated, then asked, "Why didn't you fight harder back then?" Her expression shifted, a shadow passing through her eyes. "Because fighting them would have destroyed me. They had money, lawyers, the press. I didn't. I left quietly because it was the only way to survive. I thought if I kept my head down I could rebuild. But," she gestured vaguely around them, "sometimes the shadow follows you." Ethan was silent for a moment, the late light catching on the edges of her hair. Long moment, her gaze sharp with skepticism. You think people will listen this time? They'll listen, he said, and there was something in his voice now that belonged to the boardroom, the place where he bent rooms full of hardened executives to his will. Because this time, you're not alone. That night, in the quiet after Lila was asleep, he called a contact in Los Angeles, one of the few journalists he trusted, a woman named Andrea Vega, who had built her career on exposing the way's power. Was abused? I need you to hear a story, he told her, and I need you to tell it right. Andrea arrived 2 days later, her small recorder and notepad the only tools she carried. They sat in the sunroom, the glass walls framing the restless ocean. Grace was wary at first, her answers clipped, her posture guarded. But Andrea had a way of listening that drew more out of her than she intended to give. She spoke of the day in Pasadena, of the frantic minutes when she recognized the signs of ingestion, of how her grandmother had taught her every remedy she knew. She spoke of the way the Hales' suspicion had been immediate the moment they saw her using something they didn't understand. She spoke of the investigation that cleared her but left her reputation in ruins. Ethan sat in the corner, silent, watching her tell it. It struck him that in all their conversations she had never told him this much. Not because she hadn't wanted to, but because she hadn't believed he would believe her. When Andrea finally closed her notebook, the room felt heavier, as if they had unearthed something that had been buried too long. You did well, Ethan said later as they stood on the back terrace. The wind was sharp, carrying the salt of the ocean. I hate talking about it, Grace admitted. But if it means no one can twist it again, maybe it's worth it. He nodded. It is. And whatever happens, Lila and I know the truth. The doesn't change. She looked at him for a long time, and he couldn't quite read her expression. But for the first time since Pasadena had been mentioned, her shoulders seemed to loosen, just a fraction. The tide below crashed against the cliffs, relentless, but something in the air between them felt different now, like maybe they were no longer standing on opposite sides of it. The Enemy Strikes Back, the article ran on a Sunday morning, splashed across the front page of the Los Angeles Sentinel under the headline, Caretaker Cleared, How Power and Prejudice Nearly Destroyed a Life. Andrea Vega's words were careful, methodical, and unflinching. She laid out the Pasadena incident from start to finish, weaving in hospital records, medical testimony, and Grace's own account. She did not shy away from naming Victor Halle, or from pointing out the unspoken undertones, that a wealthy white family had turned suspicion into certainty the moment they saw a black woman using remedies they did not understand. Ethan read the piece over coffee at the long dining table, the morning sun spilling across the polished wood. Layla sat beside him in her pajamas, still groggy, picking at a plate of toast. Across the table, Grace sipped her tea in silence, her face unreadable as her name stared back at her from the printed page. He wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but he knew the answer might not be something she could or would give yet. By noon, the estate's phones began to ring. Associates, board members, old acquaintances from the tight, insular circles of wealth that Ethan had navigated for decades. Some called to praise him for standing by Grace, others, their voices careful, warned that aligning himself with a story that challenged people like Victor Halle could bring consequences. Ethan listened to all of them with the same calm detachment he used in the boardroom. What none of them seemed to understand was that this wasn't a calculated risk in a business portfolio. This was personal. It was just after 3 p.m. when the first physical sign of retaliation arrived, not in the form of lawyers or official letters, but in a sleek black Bentley pulling up the driveway without warning. Ethan had only to see the tall figure stepping out to know who it was. Victor Halle was exactly as Ethan remembered him from charity galas and shareholder dinners. Perfectly tailored suit, tan skin, a smile that photographed well but never reached his eyes. Today that smile was nowhere to be found. Ethan met him halfway up the drive, his stance firm enough to make clear that Halle would not be crossing the threshold of the house. "You've got some nerve coming here," Ethan said evenly. "We need to talk," Halle replied, his voice low but sharp. "Inside." "Say what you need to say here." Ethan didn't move. Hale's gaze flicked toward the front windows. where Lila's small face was just visible, watching from between the curtains. And behind her, Grace stood, her hands resting protectively on the child's shoulders. "You've made a mistake attaching yourself to her," Halle said. "You think this little article changes the truth? My wife and I know what happened. You've been sold a story." "No," Ethan said, his voice like stone. "You think you know the truth. The records say otherwise. And so does the doctor who treated your daughter." Halle took a slow step forward, lowering his voice further. "You're playing a dangerous game. My reach goes further than you realize." Ethan leaned in, his own voice dropping to a razor's edge. "So does mine, and unlike you, I have nothing to hide." For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Hale's smile returned, brittle and cold. "You'll regret this." He turned, stepping back into his Bentley, and drove away without another word. Inside, Ethan found Grace in the living room, her eyes still fixed on the driveway. "He won't let it go," she said quietly. "Neither will I," Ethan replied. 2 days later, Lila's school called. Her teacher reported that a man had been lingering near the gates during dismissal, watching the children. When approached by staff, he left quickly, but the description matched Hale's driver. Ethan's jaw tightened as he listened. He arranged for a private security team to monitor both the estate and the school immediately. That night over dinner, Lila asked, "Daddy, why do those men in black suits keep following us now?" Ethan forced a small smile. "They're just here to keep us safe, sweetheart." Across the table, Grace met his eyes, her own expression speaking volumes. She knew what this meant. 3 nights later, the first smear appeared online, a gossip blog claiming that Grace had been paid off to keep quiet about injuring the Halle girl years ago. The story was vague, unsupported, but calculated to plant doubt. Ethan's legal team moved within hours, issuing takedown notices, and Andrea Vega herself published a sharp rebuttal backed by documents. Still, Ethan could feel the intent behind it, not to win outright, but to chip away at Grace's credibility, to exhaust her into retreat. Then came the call from Detective Harris. "I've been looking deeper into the Pasadena case," he said. "Your friend Halle isn't as untouchable as he thinks. I've found financial records payouts to 2 witnesses who testified against Grace, payments made just days after they gave statements." Ethan's grip tightened around the phone. "So we use it?" "Carefully," Harris cautioned. "If this leaks wrong, it looks like a smear campaign, but it could also bait him into making a mistake, one we can catch him on." That evening, Ethan told Grace what Harris had found. She listened quietly, her face calm, but her hands folded so tightly he could see the strain in her knuckles. "If this means ending it, I'll do whatever's needed," she said finally. Ethan studied her in the fading light of the terrace, the ocean wind cool against his face. "It's not just about ending it anymore," he said. "It's about making sure no one can ever do this to you again." The tide crashed against the cliffs below, steady and relentless. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the same way, steady, relentless, and entirely unwilling to let someone else write the ending to this story. The final stand. The days after Harris revealed the evidence against Victor Halle were charged with a quiet, coiled tension. The Carrington estate became a place of deliberate movements and hushed conversations. Security men were posted at the gates, their black SUVs discreetly shadowing Lila to school and back, their presence an unspoken reminder that the danger wasn't gone, only waiting. Ethan had faced corporate wars that stretched over months, battles fought in shareholder meetings, and hostile takeovers, but this was different. Those had been about profit and dominance. This was about a child's safety, a woman's name, and the kind of truth you couldn't quantify on a balance sheet. Harris came to the estate one late afternoon, the ocean behind him a restless sheet of silver beneath the heavy sky. He carried a small leather briefcase and the kind of expression that said he was about to ask for more than either Ethan or Grace might be ready to give. In the study, with the door closed, Harris laid out the plan, a controlled meeting with Halle, staged to make him feel as though Ethan was willing to negotiate. Ethan would bring the damaging documents, copies of the hospital records, the proof of witness payouts, and offer to keep them buried in exchange for Hale's withdrawal from their lives. The entire meeting would be under surveillance, with audio and video ready to catch any incriminating admission or threat. The key, Harris said, is making him believe he has the upper hand until the moment he doesn't. Grace listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze steady on Harris's face. When he was done, she asked only one question. And if he doesn't take the bait? Harris's mouth curved in a grim half-smile. Then we'll adjust. But from what I know of men like Halle, he won't be able to resist asserting control. It's in his nature to show you who he thinks you are beneath him. Ethan hated the idea of Grace being anywhere near the meeting, but she cut off his protest before it could take shape. If this is about clearing my name, I'll see it through to the end, she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. He could have argued, could have told her it wasn't worth the risk, but he knew it would have been pointless. She was already committed. The meeting was set for a Thursday evening in a municipal park's upper parking lot, place open enough to discourage anything overtly violent, but quiet enough for Harris's team to work without drawing attention. The air was heavy with the scent of eucalyptus and asphalt cooling in the early evening chill. Ethan arrived first, pulling his silver SUV into the agreed-upon spot, Grace beside him in the passenger seat. She wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable as she stared out the windshield at the sun sinking toward the horizon. They didn't have to wait long. The low purr of a luxury engine announced Hale's arrival before his black SUV rounded the corner and came to a stop a few yards away. He stepped out, flanked by two men in dark suits, broad-shouldered, with the restless, scanning gaze of hired muscle. Halle himself was immaculate, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp with the kind of smug anticipation that came from believing he'd already won. Ethan stepped out slowly, briefcase in hand, letting it hang loosely at his side. You came alone? Halle asked, his gaze sliding past him to the SUV where Grace sat. Not quite, Ethan replied. But you already knew she'd be here. Hale's smile was thin. I wanted her to hear the terms directly. They met halfway between the vehicles, the gravel crunching underfoot. Ethan set the briefcase on the hood of his car, clicking it open just enough for Halle to see the neatly stacked papers inside. Everything you're worried about is in here, hospital records. Payment. Transfers, the truth, all I want is for you to back off. Leave Grace alone, leave Lila alone. This ends now. Hale's gaze flicked to the papers, then back to Ethan's face. You think you can bargain with me? He said softly. I don't come here to negotiate. I come here to tell you how this ends. He gave a small nod to one of his men who stepped forward, and that was the moment the night split open. From the shadows at the edge of the lot, figures emerged, Harris and his officers, moving fast, weapons drawn, voices cutting through the air. Police, hands where we can see them. Halle froze, his smirk fading as the reality of the trap settled around him. One of his men dropped something metallic. A pistol before being shoved against the side of the SUV, Harris stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of satisfaction earned over months of work. Victor Halle, you're under arrest for witness tampering, conspiracy, and attempted intimidation. You have the right to remain silent. Grace stepped out of the SUV, then her movements slow, deliberate. She stopped a few feet from where Halle stood in handcuffs, meeting his eyes with a calm that seemed to strip the moment of all its noise. It's over, she said quietly. Hale's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He was guided toward the back of a patrol car, the flash of red and blue lights painting his face in sharp, fractured colors. The night air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus and the faint tang of victory. Ethan came to stand beside Grace, watching as the car pulled away. No, he said after a long moment. It's the beginning. The beginning of getting your life back. The drive back to the estate was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows the release of tension you've been carrying for too long. The security detail at the gates nodded them through without question, and the house felt different as soon as they stepped inside lighter somehow, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Lila came running down the hall in Her pajamas, her hair a tousled halo. "You're back," she said, throwing her arms around Grace. "I told Maya you'd be okay," she said to Ethan. Grace's eyes softened as she crouched to meet the child's gaze. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere, didn't I?" Later, after Lila's asleep, Ethan found Grace in the kitchen, putting away the last of the day's dishes. She looked up when he entered, but didn't speak right away. "I'm not sure." "What happens next?" she admitted finally. "What happens next?" Ethan said, leaning against the counter. "Is that you keep working here?" "You keep helping Lila grow into someone who sees people for who they are, not for what's said about them. And I make sure the world remembers what was done to you and who you really are." Her gaze held his for a long moment, and he thought. He saw something shift there, something unspoken but real. The kind of shift that didn't need words to mark it. Outside, the ocean roared against the cliffs, but for the first time in weeks, it sounded like a promise.